People think that hatred is the opposite of love, but hatred is not the opposite of love. Apathy is the opposite of love. If you don't care, you're just totally indifferent to that person. That's the opposite of love. But hatred is actually very close.
Welcome to the Sacred Life. I'm your host, Aaron Beachy, coming to you from Higher Ground Fellowship. And today we are going to be discussing the topic of hate. We have with us John Baylor and David Baylor. And John is going to introduce our subject today. And I've heard that it's kind of his pet subject.
I love hatred.
So go ahead and clue us in, John.
Well, I've mentioned this idea in some of our other topics when we've done our ancient insights. That I've brought in some of these ideas before, but it's struck me a lot, this idea that hatred is very closely akin to love. And I heard this first from a psychologist that I work with. I don't know if I should say first, but very strikingly from this guy. Who had done a lot of marriage counseling, but that's actually the job he's in now, but he wasn't at this time, but he'd done some in the past. And he said people think that hatred is the opposite of love, but hatred is not the opposite of love. Apathy is the opposite of love. If you don't care, you're just totally indifferent to that person. That's the opposite of love. But hatred is actually very close. And if I've got a couple that's fighting with each other, then I have something I can build on. If I have a married couple that hates each other, then basically, like, there's a way to solve this. But if I have people that don't care about each other, that don't have any interest in one another, that don't have anything to do with each other, then I've got a dead marriage on my hands, and there's just very, very little I can do. And so that was influential for me in kind of thinking. Like I said, I sort of heard of that idea before, but it left quite an impression. But when I say, I say things like hatred is a kind of love, and what I have in mind is that if you hate something, then it is like the center of your attention, and so like you're devoting your whole person to that thing that you hate. And part of the reason why I want to deal with this as a topic is because I see hatred as like the modus operandi for so many people, and so many like cultural commentators, people who, like, you get clicks on YouTube because you're going to shower your hatred on something that you see the flaws in, which, something that is evil or has evil in it. Okay, but like, so does what you're doing, like, so does everything else that, wherever you turn your eye. But you've chosen to pour all of your attention onto this thing. And there's this sense. I don't. This is probably like a heretical idea here, but like I just can't escape this idea that hatred, as I say, it's like love, but it's, I think of it as being like a kind of worship. Um, and I also have this idea that, like, maybe this is what devil worship actually is. Maybe if you love something purely and truly, because there are twisted ways of loving things that are directed away from God. But if you love something in a pure and proper way, then that is like an act of worship of God. And if you hate something, then, I have this idea that I can't quite escape. I don't want to state it as a fact, but I have this sense that, like, to hate something is to worship what's evil, and is like giving your worship to the devil.
Well, it's like there is this sense in which hatred and condemnation and accusation and judgment and all of these things directed at a person or a group of person exerts a very real sort of power over them. And it's like you can hate somebody and cast them into a certain role, and like there's almost like this sense in which you can make them into that thing.
Yeah, so I mean, I've mentioned that idea to you, but this is also part of what makes it akin to worshiping the devil or worshiping a demon to me is um, because there's this idea that's just been around forever, as far as I know, that if you worship a god or worship a demon, then you bring it into the world, or you give it power in the world. You give it a physical presence in the world that it didn't have before. But now that you give it worship, it has like a foothold here in the world.
Right.
So you've opened a door for it, not just to your own heart, but like to the world as a whole.
Yeah.
And when you hate something, then I think that happens. When you hate something, you wind up bringing it into the world. And you're kind of saying this, but I'll try to paint it a little more visually, I guess. If I'm an adult and you're a young person, you're adolescent, and I have some reason why I hate you. I'm an adult. I'm a responsible person. I'm not really supposed to hate kids, young people. But there is just something that makes me really resent you. And maybe it's that I think that you don't have any respect for authority. I mean, it could be anything. Like, just pick something that you could say is a sin. But I'm just gonna go with that one. So you don't have any respect for authority. That's your problem. And I just keep pushing that idea on you. And there's two ways that you are likely to respond as a young person. One way that you're not likely to respond is just to say, he doesn't know what he's talking about, who cares about him, and ignore it. You're really not that likely to do that. So what you're probably going to do is you're either going to say, again, one of two things. You're going to say, I am not what this guy thinks I am, and I'm going to do everything in my power to prove to him that I'm a respectful young man and I'm a good person. And the other way that you can respond to that is you can say, you know what, I hate him too. And if he thinks that I'm disrespectful to authority, I'm going to show him what it means to be disrespectful to authority. And so now you really turn it on. And maybe you had a little bit of a problem there, but now you just open up the floodgates.
Mm-hmm.
And so what has happened is that I have hated something in you, and my hatred has drawn that thing out of you and into the world, and now it's everybody's problem.
Well, so I guess so where my mind is going would be like to Proverbs and places throughout. I don't know. I think of this more as being something you find in the Old Testament, about like just the idea of cursing somebody and pronouncing a curse on somebody. And then in the New Testament, I think this is related more to the idea of holding somebody in judgment. And like there is this idea in the Bible, it's like be really careful about that, because you actually can curse somebody. You actually can pronounce a curse on somebody's life. Like you actually can call down demons upon somebody through your cursings. This is something that is real, that actually happens.
So do you have, like, just again to explain what you're talking about, like what's a quick example of how that exists, like just as a part of reality?
I think a good example would be gossip. How like the effect that gossip has on bending and shaping reality. It's like you can accuse. So like you have this in the like both the Hebrew word Satan and the Greek word that's devil essentially mean the same thing. In the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament, it just uses diabolos, devil, for Satan. So like it's basically just a Greek version of the same word. They both basically have the idea behind them of slander and false accusation.
Yeah.
So it's like
false accusation. I mean, like that's
right.
That's a powerful curse that you have the power to place on somebody else's life.
Yeah. So it's like it's like this hatred that you've directed, or this enmity that you've directed towards somebody, in some way, at some measure, ends up having a profound impact on everybody. Like everybody in contact with that person. And like,
forcing this person into a role. So like that'd be a good example of that.
Yeah.
I was also thinking about, so like, Second Temple Jewish people and like Jewish people around the time of Christ were absolutely fixated on this idea of the evil eye. And so like we will find in like excavations of houses and public buildings and like graves, these depictions of a talisman that's meant to like they would wear necklaces of an eyeball, or have these painted on their houses or something like that to ward off the evil eye. And I think that's still a thing in the Middle East.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah, it's also something that's kind of, I don't know, it's gained like a little bit of popularity in the West and in America, like in modern, like just like a little trend, you know, not like something that's become a staple of our culture. But if you want to find like, I mean, just get online and try to buy an evil eye necklace, and there'll be tons of people selling them.
Right. But like, so what that idea is that if I look at you with envy or jealousy or hatred, then that brings a curse onto your life. And the way they would say that kind of curse works is that, like, basically how you were already defining it, is that you open the door for a demon. So like they would have seen this as a spiritual reality. And like when you're talking about, so like I use the example of gossip or things like that. We might tend today to think of the power that gossip has as simply cause and effect. I say bad things about you, and then people believe the bad things, and then they treat you badly accordingly, and it can work that way.
But people don't even have to believe it in order to, like, you know, I don't want to associate that with that person. I mean, even if it may just be that I think other people might believe it, and I don't want to be associated with somebody that has those kind of rumors flying around them, which is not like necessarily the most noble way for me to behave, but it's still like people don't behave in the most noble possible way.
Yeah, but it's like the simple cause and effect, like some simple causal relationship to the results of the gospel, like ends up not being sufficient to explain the depth, the severity of its consequences. And so like, you know, Solomon, when he's writing about it, probably is not thinking in terms of you say bad things about people and here's the effect of that. He's probably thinking in terms of you say bad things about people, you're opening the door for demons. So like, don't do that.
Yeah. I'm going to give kind of a sort of lighthearted example.
Yeah, I guess I want to bring that back a little bit too, is good, because part of the reason that the cause and effect relationship is insufficient is because it's reciprocal. Like somehow that curse ends up turning back on you in a way that just like logically doesn't always make sense.
Yeah. Just as I said, I had this sort of lighthearted example, and I really don't know what to make of this, because when I heard this story, I thought like, that's witchcraft, but it's like it's somebody like doing it in this sort of lighthearted kind of prank way. And I believe this was our great grandpa, who he'd go to a horse show and he'd go up to one of his friends and he'd say, "Hey, how you doing? You're not looking too good." And, you know, just kind of put it in the guy's head. And then he'd have a couple of other friends come up to him and say, "Hey, are you feeling well?" And just several people throughout the course of this day just ask this guy if he's sick, and then at the end of the day, he'd be sick. and the reason why, the reason why, like, I just can't make up my mind if this is horrible or not is just because, like, that guy was their friend, and they were just
cursing him. Like, I got a good prank. Let's call demons down on our buddy.
But it's like there are some things that you can say to somebody that are like really mean, but you can also say those same things to a friend, and like they're part of the joke. Like it's no longer a cruel thing anymore.
Yeah.
But you know, I mean, that's just
Yeah, I had heard the story that it was Grandpa and some of his cousins at a farm show.
Yeah,
So
okay.
I don't know which version is true.
It could be. I mean, I great grandpa was more of a jokester than our
Mhm.
grandpa was, so that's the only reason I
Right.
thought it might have been him instead. But yeah, it's a you know some Swiss Anabaptist witchcraft that's going on there.
Which is a thing, by the way.
Yeah, right.
To go a little bit back to this idea, John, that you mentioned of the scenario you talked about of you dislike something about a person or
Mhm.
hate something
Yeah,
about
yeah.
a person, and you hammer them with it.
Yeah.
You could almost say you hammer the weakness.
Mm-hmm.
By hammering the weakness, you make the weakness even weaker. And there's this idea that you mentioned hate being as like a form of love. A lot of times people will tend to do that because they desperately want the person to, you know, maybe sometimes they desperately want the person to be able to improve or, you know, there's a twisted way.
Well, if you're the adult, say you're a teacher and you've got this kid in your class and he's just like really annoying you and disrupting your class and all that, like that's going to be frustrating to you, and you are also going to recognize this guy could be better than what he is, and that's part of why it's frustrating to you because it's like, man, if this guy would get his act together, he could really be something. But you know, I don't think that's exactly why you. I don't think it's out of that kind of love and hope for improvement that you like unleash your hatred on somebody. I think that's you've come to a point of weakness. But yeah, I mean, maybe you can find positive drives in that too.
Well, and it could be too that the reason you're hammering their weakness so hard and through like hate is maybe because you see it in yourself
Mm-hmm.
too. That
Yeah, if I'm accusing him of not respecting authority, then it's probably like I demand more respect than what I'm getting. But sometimes it could be just what you're describing, that like, man, I was the same way, or I'm guilty of that same thing, and I hated it so much in myself, and I hate it so much in somebody else as well.
And but there's another side to that too. Is like not only can it come from a place of having hated that in myself in the past, as it can also be like I hate that that's who I am.
Mm-hmm.
But oftentimes that's a subconscious realization.
Yeah.
So like that would be psychological projection.
Mm-hmm.
That
most generally that's not actually realized.
yeah,
That's
which is why so like biblically you have this concept. So like Jesus talks about like picking the speck out of your own eye when you need to have a log in your own, and there is this biblical concept of like examining yourself primarily.
Mm-hmm.
Like keep your eye fixed on yourself, and you find this also in the church fathers quite prominently. It's not like your eye needs to be focused on yourself,
Yeah.
examining it. Like you need like your soul, the eye of your soul is how they would say it.
Mm-hmm.
Needs to be looking inward upon itself.
Well, let's solve the problem in a minute because I want to develop just in one more dimension here.
Okay.
So I've talked about this on a sort of individual level. There's something about you that I hate, but I think this same thing exists on a larger scale. I think I don't say this with an attempt to like like this isn't some kind of attack on Donald Trump, but the reason that Donald Trump was elected was out of a response to things that Democrats hated, and I think there's something.
Well, I think you could like just so that we can be fair and even is you could probably also make the argument that's also why Joe Biden was elected was not because anybody liked Donald Trump or Joe Biden,
Mhm.
it's because they hated the other guy.
Well, but I'm not talking about hated the other guy. I'm talking about like, I'm talking about Democrats hated, you might just say misogyny.
Mm-hmm.
Democrats hated, I mean, I think like accusations about Trump saying he's like white supremacist or something. That's why I say I'm not trying to attack him. I think that's sort of a misrepresentation of him, but he's still very much like the people that are in the ordinary people that are normal, that are at the center of the society. We've been pushing them down in order to lift up people that are at the margins, and we're going to stop doing that. And so you can look at him and say like, oh, he's misogynistic, he's racist, he's all these things. And because Democrats hated all those things so much, I think there was something in Republican voters that said, look, if you hate that so much, I'm going to vote for it. I'm going to put the thing that is the most vile and disgusting to you. And yes, they also hated Hillary, who was running against him. But that's different than what I'm describing. I'm saying because you guys hate that, I'm going to bring it into the world with my vote.
It's the same dynamic now. They're talking about trying him for certain crimes and possibly putting him in prison. Well, what's the reaction?
Yeah,
Because you're going to do that, I'm going to vote for him.
Yeah, right.
Right.
And there was the name's escaping to me. There was a guy, I think this was a Senate race in Alabama, and all kinds of accusations came out against him for like sexual molestation or something like that. And so everybody came out and voted for him in droves. And that was a Republican candidate again. So for Democrats, they see this and it's like, why in the world would they do this? It's like, well, they did it because you hated the guy, and because there's a little bit of a boy who cried wolf thing where it's like, if you throw these accusations around too much, we are just going to defy you. Like whenever someone's accused, then we're going to bring that into the world. It's like your accusation and your hatred is what brings that thing into the world.
Right.
That's like the way that politics works now. People talk about there's too much division in politics. The result of this division in politics is that on both sides, you're going to get people that are more extreme and more repulsive to the other side. But it's like it's all driven by our mutual hatred of one another.
Well, so like that's also true in Christianity and has been for, I don't know, 600 years, probably in the West. Like the division in Christianity in the West started well before the Reformation. Like the Reformation was essentially just a recognition of the reality of the situation. So it's like part of the reason when we're talking about this collapse into materialism and this loss of an understanding of spiritual things, or this like desire to cast all of these things as being superstitious nonsense, is because so many people are obsessed with being as not Catholic as they can be.
Yeah.
And so anything that looks or smells or even has the slightest hint of Catholicism in it is like, I don't want like away with that.
Yeah, right.
It's evil.
Yeah, that's something that always bothers me. Like there are more important things to be a Christian than not being Catholic.
Yeah, but so it's like when we're talking about all these things, the way hatred is like a perverted worship. It's like you start worshiping, like essentially your entire focus is Catholicism.
Right.
And so you are in a perverse way worshiping the Pope. Worshiping Catholicism.
I mean, in a sense, you could say, well, this will be since you use the word Pope there, this won't quite work. I was going to say you're like worshiping anti-Catholicism by hating Catholicism. But when you use the word Pope, it's like, I don't want to say you're worshiping the anti-Pope because that's a historical term.
Right.
But like you're taking the thing and you're creating in your mind the opposite of it, and you're worshiping that thing by hating this thing.
Right. Well, I mean, and like that is sort of the pagan process. Because like what you see in paganism is eventually the branding of God as the bad guy. And so like the structure of paganism is essentially a hatred of God. And so like they yeah, I don't know if that quite makes sense. But like it is, I don't know, an ideology that's born out of hatred. Which is like, it's kind of interesting to look at it that way, because there's a lot of ways in which you can say that the modern world is collapsing into paganism, and I'm not referring to these like modern reconstructed pseudo pagan religions
Mhm.
that have nothing to do with actual paganism. I'm talking about, no, it's collapsing back into actual paganism, which means this really fractured idea.
This sounds like a big can of worms that I don't think we should get into, but I think it's interesting what you're saying. When I would, if we develop this more, maybe in another talk, then I would want you to say, what's your argument that paganism comes from hatred of God?
Mhm.
But if we can make that claim, then we have a society that's like predicated on hatred of God.
Yeah.
And so if that's the pagan pattern, then what you say is true. Like naturally, we're going to be
Right.
going in that direction. But that sounds like a complex argument that I
Yeah.
think.
And I'd want to do some more, like, have some more like facts
Yeah.
and like biblical references and stuff I can throw out
Mhm.
to back that claim. So that'd be a good discussion for some other time, like you said.
Yeah, I think so. Another thing that I want to mention, this relates to what I said about politics. Like, if I see that, the people on that side of the political aisle hate something, then I'm going to vote for it. I'm just gonna like,
Right.
I want to spite them. Their priorities are wrong, so if they hate something, well, that's just who I'm gonna be.
Well, it's
So,
like,
so we have that problem, but then I guess I referenced this already, but conservative commentators are really bad about this right now. I don't know. I mean, if you get on your favorite conservative YouTube channel, then you're going to find tons of videos of the person that you like the most just talking on and on about the thing that he hates. And maybe it's like some new Disney movie that's come out, or maybe it's something that somebody did during Pride Month, or a lot of times it's just like, look at what this stupid liberal did on TikTok. And if they weren't putting their video on there, nobody would have paid any attention to this stupid TikTok person. So like, you've taken this person and actually, by showering your hatred on them, you've put them on a pedestal, you've given them a huge audience, you've expanded their influence in the world and not reduced it. So if your goal was to make this thing have less influence, then it's not working.
So
Your hatred that you're putting out there for the public is giving more power to the thing that you think you're undermining.
So there's a good recent example of hatred over one side doing something resulting in a backlash of hatred the other way. We've all probably heard about the Bud Light thing and Dylan Mulvaney. Conservatives declare up and down now they'll never drink Bud Light or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
Bill Gates just announced he's investing $10 billion into Bud Light.
Yeah.
That's an example of what we're talking
Right.
about.
Yeah.
It's hate versus hate,
Mm-hmm.
and it gets you nowhere.
Yeah.
It's basically mutually assured destruction.
Right.
well, so it's like, it's interesting. So like, you look at, both world wars. I was thinking specifically of World War One, as like, at least in World War Two, you can look at it and say like, there were actual reasons to fight.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like World War One, you look at it and say it's like, there is no reason for this war to have ever happened.
Mm-hmm.
Like there was no cause, there was no objective, there was nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Like all there was hatred,
Yeah.
and it's like no.
Yeah, and it's like, I mean, why was that hatred there? Like,
It's like,
I don't know that there's a good answer. I mean, you can come up with explanations for it, but like, the fact is, once the war broke out and then we have these alliances lining up, then you just start looking for reasons to hate the people that you're supposed to be against.
well, and like there's also this sense in which World War One transformed the United States into a monster.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like, before World War One, the largest, like, this is actually still true, that the largest ethnic group in America is of German descent. But like, before World War One, that was out in the public for everybody to see. The second most spoken language in America was
Mhm.
German. German culture everywhere. Very like like this fraternal relationship with the Germanic homeland for a lot of people,
Mm-hmm.
and like German identity being a major part of a lot of people's American identity.
Yeah.
But then World War One happens, and for some reason, we've got to hate everything German.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like there's this way in which this hatred just warped the soul of the country and transformed it into something that it had never been before.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting that Americans are deliberately divorced from our heritage. I say our heritage, but I mean that in an individual sort of way. Like, because we don't all share a common heritage, but like all these German people are now trying to be divorced from their German heritage, and everybody else around them is going to be divorced from their own, the heritage of their own people or their own family or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's the American way, is to have no history.
Right, but that wasn't the case before the First World
Right.
War. Like before the First World War, America was
You could cherish the old world.
it's like America was an actual melting pot, like
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that like not that your cultural identity was erased, but it's like your cultural identity was your identity, but it was growing into a cohesive identity. But it's like now it's just like we just gotta wipe everything out because it turns out we're supposed to hate everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's just like this weird way that hatred winds up dominating and controlling how you interact with the world. And just going back.
So what's the better way? I want to kind of wrap this up soon, so I want to shift to some conclusions here. What's the better way, or maybe I should say, like if you're in this cycle where you recognize, man, this is the way I am. So much of my psyche is devoted to hatred of one thing or another, one ideology or another. What's the better way, or what's the way out of that?
I guess my immediate response would be the life of Christ. Because I think that's something that's actually a central element of the gospel story. It's like here's the condition, the human condition,
Mhm.
and hatred is one of the aspects of that human condition. It's like it turns out it's not a problem that you are able to solve.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you were able to solve it, God's giving you his instruction manual with all of the perfect instructions.
Yeah.
Should have worked.
Yeah.
But the fact that it didn't is demonstration that that's not the solution.
Mm-hmm.
I guess what I'm trying to say that's a little esoteric, maybe the way I'm putting that, is that the solution isn't like to directly tackle this problem of hatred
Mm-hmm.
as
Right.
something that is something in itself.
When I was formulating the question in my mind, I was running through what are the ways that you would replace hatred with love and all this, and once the question was out of my mouth, then what I heard in my head was that you turn to Jesus Christ,
Mhm.
or you seek the peace of God.
Right.
I don't want to give too much of like an Anabaptist plug, but I think the central message of Anabaptism is simplicity.
Right.
And in we say like traditional Anabaptist dress, that's a way that's expressed symbolically. But like, what good is simplicity? Well, if you recognize simplicity as valuable, then you can look around your house and think like, how can this cluttered mess be a simpler place? And you can look at your relationships with other people and you can think like, how can this be simpler? And you can look at like what's going on in your own person and say, how can I have simplicity in here? And I mention that just because of that idea of seeking the peace of God. It's not that like being an Anabaptist is going to solve your problem, or adopting the Anabaptist way is going to do it, but just that there's a symbol in there that tells you simplicity is good.
Yeah, well,
Peace rather than internal conflict. Internal peace is good and to be desired.
yeah, I guess to take that idea a little further and say like it's okay to say that, give the plug for that Anabaptist idea, because the Anabaptists didn't come up with that idea on their own. Like that is actually the Christian idea. Where they get that idea, like they did, like Anabaptist thinkers didn't sit down and study the Bible and come up with that idea on their own. They told us where they got it from. They said, here's where this is the teaching of the church fathers. And here is where this is the teaching of the apostles.
Yeah.
That's how they looked at that, like this idea of simplicity and of stripping away the complexity, the complex interpretation, the complex way of living, the complex question and answer, problem and solution way of looking at the world. It's like, no, the scripture and the word referring to Christ, and the apostles and the fathers of the church all say this is the way, and it is exemplified through the person of Jesus Christ. What also came to my mind is transfiguration. It's like this idea of the transformation of your corrupted nature into a glorified nature. So it's like we talked about, like rebranding, since we're sort of rebranding our our channel here, or our mission. Like we talked about using the phrase to rebrand it as like a transfiguration of our outlook and our way of thinking. It's like that's ultimately what's needed. It's like that thing that is mortal and corrupt and temporary and dying, and like needs like the transfiguration of Christ on the mountain, like represented in its glorified sense. I don't know quite how to put that thought together, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, if you frame this as a demon that you're worshiping, you know, I mean, when I was talking about the Catholic Church, I was holding my hand up here and saying, like, here's the thing that you hate, and what that means is you're creating this imaginary thing right here. Like, I'm sort of imagining a Catholic Church, and then like a negative, like a negative photograph, you know, but like a negative reflection in the water, and like I'm worshiping that negative reflection of the Catholic Church. I mean, if that's like a something that you could call a demon that you're worshiping, or a demon that has power over you, then it's also a question of like, okay, how do you get this hatred out of your life? That's sort of a question like, how do you cast out a demon?
Right.
Which, I mean, I think some of the answers that we gave are still on that topic. But, you know, I mean, like, prayer and fasting is a way.
Well, so it's like Paul, after his conversion, like isn't like immediately on fire for Christ and going out and casting out devils and planting churches and all of this. Like sometimes we have this conception of him as having done that, but it's not what he did. He tells us himself what he did was he went and spent 3 years in the desert. And it's like Moses, the same thing, spent 40 years in the desert before he came back to Egypt. It's like I think in both of those, like Christ also 40 days in the desert, but I don't, it's not quite for the same reason with Christ. Christ did
well, but with Christ, he's going out there like
he is going out to be tempted.
To be tempted. He's going out there to face the devil.
Right.
And I mean, like part of how you deal with a demon is like you learn the name of the demon, and then you have a kind of power over that you didn't have before. It was like if you understand that this is a demon and this has power over your life, just that understanding, just being able to point a finger at it and say, yeah, this is a thing, this is real, this is having influence over me, just that puts you in a very different position than you were in before you realize that your life was governed by hatred, and that it was giving you the opposite of what you want out of life.
Yeah.
Like realizing that alone, like that's a nice first step.
Yeah, so what about, like, this just popped into my mind, like, what about hatred of the devils and hatred of sin?
Yeah, it's, I'm ready to wrap up the conversation. That's well, it's like that question opens up another level of things. For right now, I will say that I think that there are times in the Bible, in an English translation of the Bible, you're going to see hatred in a positive sense, in terms of hating sin, in terms of like God saying, I hate your feast days, for example. So we have God hating things that's mentioned in the Bible. I think that I'm just going to try to find myself a simple backdoor out of that and say that there may be a kind of equivocation in there where it's like the same word is being used, but it's a different thing that's meant. Where like I think hating what's evil and clinging to what's good, hating the sin, can it can be a different category. I mean, you can be. I think you could actually hate your sin in a way that's counterproductive. I
Yeah.
do think that's possible.
Well,
But
you
I
can
think
certainly
I think
hate.
it's also possible to use the word hate and to be talking about something that's different than this like consuming focus of your attention.
Yeah, like I would say, I think you could reduce it down to a statement as simply as, if your perspective is the hatred of sin, and what that means is my entire focus is on not sinning, then you are going to be controlled by sin. And like that strikes me as like not in character with Christ's words. It's like what is the character of his words strikes me as more of you're released from you're released from the necessity of having to think about these things.
If I can use my image again, if this is evil and I've got this negative reflection of it in the water down here below, and I'm hating evil, then that means like then I'm worshiping what's good through my hatred of evil. And again, I mean, maybe I'm just playing like a kind of logical game by doing that, because as I said, I do think there's a kind of hatred of evil
Yeah.
that is a kind of unhealthy obsession. I think that kind of hatred is something different than the sort of hatred that I have for my enemies. And yet there's a sense in which it kind of still works out in a way that, like, well, even following my rules, maybe there is a right way that you would hate evil and that you would hate sin. I don't want to get too much into that. I think we've hit our conclusions.
Yeah.
And that's really where I wanted to leave it, is this turn toward Christ, turn toward the peace of God.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe we mentioned prayer and fasting, but I mean, above all, just say, like, let go of those things and turn your heart toward what is good.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to
Yeah.
good place to leave it.
All right. Well, we thank you for joining us today on The Sacred Life, and please offer your comments and thoughts, questions as well. We would love to have feedback from our listeners, so feel free to participate in that forum. Again, we thank you for joining us today, and we wish you peace in Christ.